Hello, I'm Bob Trebshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about why a Roman road along a nationally significant watershed became the biggest cultural boundary in England. If you live in Leicestershire, you think of yourself as in the East Midlands, and presumably speak an East Midlands dialect. If you live in Warwickshire, you think of yourself as West Midlands, and, assuming you were born and brought up there, speak a West Midlands dialect. And what separates Leicestershire from Warwickshire? Well, nowadays it's a busy main road, some of it a dual carriageway, the A5. But that follows the route of the Roman road known as Watling Street, running from London to Wroxeter, and almost certainly it was an Iron Age routeway before the Romans. Watling Street mostly follows a ridgeway, as do many prehistoric routes. Ridgeways are of course on the watersheds or interfluves between valleys, and my best guess is that the prehistoric concept of territory also followed valleys, so the high ground in between was liminal, probably used for shared grazing. Any routes through such liminal spaces could be used by traders and armed gangs or whoever wanted to travel freely around settlements and territories. However, there's something really curious about the watershed which Watling Street follows. Give or take the upper reaches of 2 or 3 rivers, it divides all the rivers of England into those which flow to the south and west, into the English Channel and the Severn Estuary, from those that flow north and east into the North Sea. I have every reason to think that this was very much liminal territory in the Iron Age. Why? Because of something that's not there. Iron Age folks built dramatic hill forts to dominate their territory. Hill forts are, of course, on hills, and Watling Street follows hills. But there's very few Iron Age hill forts along it. The implication is that Watling Street ran between Iron Age territories, so no one had the right, so to speak, to create an imposing hill fort. And the exceptions for Iron Age hill forts, such as Oldbury near Atherstone in Warwickshire, are the later, less dramatic type of Iron Age fortifications. I know of similar examples at Ratby in Leicestershire and Oxton in Nottinghamshire. These all seem to be the basis for Iron Age, shall we call them robber barons, trading with the Roman Empire on the continent. Slaves are likely to have been a big part of their income. And they establish these defendable bases in liminal locations near major routeways. So why should a road become a regional boundary? Well, why not? It was a clear enough landmark, and one that couldn't be moved. Other Roman roads also end up as boundaries, such as the Fosse Way to the north of Leicester, becoming the boundary between Framlin Hundred to the east and Goscott Hundred to the west. And Watling Street really came into its own in 878, because a treaty was signed between Alfred the Great of Wessex and the Viking warlord Guthrum. Alfred had defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in Wiltshire, and the outcome was that Alfred retained all the land to the south and west of Watling Street, while Guthrum had control over the land to the north and east. This was to become known as the Danelaw. The land held by Alfred was referred to as Wessex, even though until then Warwickshire, Worcestershire, Gloucestershire and the northern half of Wiltshire had been part of Mercia. During the next 100 or so years there was extensive Scandinavian settlement in the Danelaw. Many places got named, or presumably more often renamed, using Scandinavian personal names along with the Scandinavian word for settlement, by. In contrast, such names are rare to the south of Watling Street. Predictably, the language spoken in the Danelaw became much more Scandinavian. At the time, the language spoken in Wessex was a dialect of German, the earlier form of Old English. Until about the 12th or 13th century, Wessex, right the way up to the West Midlands, continued speaking a form of Old English with few Scandinavian loanwords, while instead the folks in the Danelaw spoke an ever-evolving version of Old English with considerable influences from Old Scandinavian. Only in around the 14th century did the East Midlands version of what is by then Middle English become adopted in London, and then steadily used more widely throughout the country. We're all aware, even if we rarely consciously think about it, that written English is more formal than the way we typically speak. For the purposes of this video, I'll usually use the word dialect as an abbreviation for all aspects of dialect, accent and pronunciation, even though for the specialist the word dialect refers to words and phrases spoken locally, and rarely if ever used in writing, rather than to the accent and pronunciation. All modern varieties of English, including Southern English, retain many words and phrases which originated in the 14th century East Midlands dialect. In a book published in 1490, William Caxton tells the story of some merchants from the north of England who were trying to buy eggs from a woman in the south of England. The northerners used the word egges, derived from the Old Norse, but the southern woman used the word iron, which is the Old English plural for eggs. The woman didn't understand, and Caxton makes a rather amusing tale out of the misunderstandings. However, accent and pronunciation has shifted several times as a result of successive vowel shifts. The Southern Standard English accent is now very different to East Midlands dialects. By the time people were taking an interest in regional dialects in the 19th century, the West Midlands accent and dialect was very distinct from the East Midlands accent and dialect. In Warwickshire, the Norman towns like Nuneaton and Bedworth have a similar accent to Coventry, whereas southern Warwickshire people generally have a much more southern accent. Coventry is regarded as the city where northern and southern dialects merge. There's also an east-west divide in accent because of the former existence of the Forest of Arden, which made travel difficult between Coventry and the West Midland areas, which are now Birmingham and Black Country conurbations. So back to where I started. If Coventry is where the dialects merge, then Watling Street is where West Midlands dialects sharply diverge from East Midlands dialects. The width of the road separates two very distinct dialects and accents. This makes it the steepest dialect divide, or isogloss, in Britain. In practice, this means that towns straddling Watling Street, such as Hinckley just to the north, and Nuneaton and Atherstone just to the south, once had distinct dialects and accents. Clearly in recent decades, commuting to work between these towns has diluted the distinctiveness. And it's not just the dialect. Sometime in the mid-1980s, I came across a study of the marriage registers for parishes either side of Watling Street, such as Claybrook in Leicestershire and Clifton upon Dunsmore in Warwickshire. And these revealed that very few marriages were made between parishes in the different counties. In Claybrook in the 19th century, about 90% of people married someone from Leicestershire. Clearly there was a real cultural difference between folk in Leicestershire and folk in Warwickshire, and it was not the done thing to cross the county boundary for the sort of social events which would lead to unmarried men and women meeting. And that county boundary remained a formidable psychological barrier into the middle of the 20th century. Back in 2009, I gave a talk to the Clifton upon Dunsmore local history group. And during questions after the talk, one of the group's members recalled as a child, so I think just after the Second World War, that on Sunday afternoons she and her family walked out to the village along Lilbourne Lane. They got as far as Watling Street and always turned back. They never set foot in Leicestershire. And it wasn't as if the 1940s traffic along the A5 on a Sunday would have been so intimidating. The endless succession of Eddie Stobart lorries and so forth is much more recent. Underlying both the same county marriage pattern and the curtailed Sunday strolls, there is of course the much darker country custom of very violent inter-village rivalries. In the first half of the 19th century and later, it simply wasn't safe to turn up in another village uninvited. These village rivalries were mediated only when the men began moving to towns to work in factories and live in streets of terraced housing, and it required deliberate attempts to mediate the problem. Would you believe, first of all, county cricket was invented, and as this didn't work out as well as hoped, then town-based football teams. But how sport and, shall we call it, social engineering were brought together is perhaps best left for a future video. Next time you have a reason to be travelling along the A5, especially the section which divides Leicestershire from Warwickshire, then think of the prehistoric drovers and traders. the Roman soldiers and messengers heading from London to Wroxeter, and the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex facing off to the Scandinavians in the Danelaw, no doubt trading insults in two very distinct versions of Old English. And, well, 1,000 years later, that had evolved very little, so there was still a serious risk of life and limb if the younger villagers transgressed each county's confines. That in turn inhibited marriages between adjacent parishes in different counties, and, well, continued to limit the destination of Sunday afternoon strolls in the 1940s.